You can lose weight, watch the scale drop, and still carry the most dangerous fat in your body. It does not sit under your skin. It wraps around your organs, your liver, your pancreas, your intestines. This is visceral fat, and it is strongly linked to type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart disease, and metabolic dysfunction. Here is the dominant question behind today's title. What is the fastest, evidence-based way to shrink visceral fat safely and sustainably? Because most people think shrinking belly fat is about doing more crunches or just eating less. But visceral fat does not respond the way you think it does. If you care about metabolic health and long-term disease prevention, this matters more than the number on your scale. If you find practical, science-backed breakdowns helpful, subscribe so you do not miss the next step-by-step guide. Intro reset. Let us reset the frame. Visceral fat is not just cosmetic. It is metabolically active tissue. That means it releases hormones and inflammatory chemicals that directly affect insulin sensitivity, liver function, and blood vessel health. But here is the good news. Visceral fat is also highly responsive to the right interventions. In many cases, it shrinks faster than subcutaneous fat, the fat under your skin, when you apply the correct levers. Today, I will walk you through a clear governing model. Then we will apply it step by step. The governing model, the 4 levers of visceral fat reduction. Everything we discuss will map back to 4 levers. Level 1, energy balance. This is the net difference between calories in and calories out. Visceral fat shrinks when the body is in a sustained, appropriate energy deficit. Lever 2, insulin signaling. Insulin is the hormone that helps move glucose from your blood into cells. Chronically elevated insulin encourages fat storage, especially in the abdomen. Lever 3, inflammation and oxidative stress. Oxidative stress means excess unstable molecules called free radicals damaging cells. Chronic inflammation and oxidative stress promote visceral fat accumulation. Lever 4, muscle-driven metabolic demand. Skeletal muscle is a major site of glucose disposal and fat oxidation. The more metabolically active your muscle, the more pressure you place on visceral fat stores. Every food, drink, and exercise strategy we discuss will work by pulling one or more of these levers. Chapter 1. Why visceral fat is so dangerous. Before we talk about the fastest way to shrink it, we need to understand why it behaves differently. Visceral fat drains directly into the portal circulation. That means substances released from this fat depot travel straight to the liver. This is important. When visceral fat releases free fatty acids into the bloodstream, those fatty acids go directly to the liver. Over time, this can promote non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That is fat accumulation inside liver cells not caused by alcohol. Now add chronic insulin resistance. Insulin resistance means your cells do not respond properly to insulin. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Higher insulin levels then promote more fat storage. It becomes a loop. Most people think all fat tissue is passive storage, but visceral fat secretes inflammatory cytokines. Cytokines are signaling proteins that influence immune responses. Elevated inflammatory signaling worsens insulin resistance. So we have a reinforcing cycle. More visceral fat increases inflammation. More inflammation worsens insulin resistance. Worse insulin resistance promotes more fat storage. If this cycle stays unchecked, it pushes toward type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and cardiovascular disease. Here is your first self-check moment. Measure your waist circumference at the level of your navel. If it is rising over time, even when weight is stable, that is a metabolic warning sign. Another self-check. Look at your fasting triglycerides and fasting glucose if you have access to labs. Upward trends often travel with visceral fat expansion. Recap. Visceral fat is dangerous because it feeds directly into liver dysfunction, insulin resistance, and systemic inflammation. Now that you understand the threat, we can move to the first lever that moves it quickly. Energy balance applied strategically. If visceral fat shrinks in an energy deficit, why do so many people struggle to lose it? Because not all deficits are equal in practice. Energy balance is simple in concept. You must burn more energy than you consume. But extreme restriction often backfires. Severe calorie cuts increase hunger hormones, reduce spontaneous movement, and lower metabolic rate over time. Most people think the fastest way to lose belly fat is to slash calories aggressively. But visceral fat responds better to a consistent, moderate deficit than to crash dieting. Here is what the evidence consistently shows. When total body fat decreases, visceral fat tends to decrease disproportionately, especially early in the process. Why? Visceral fat is more metabolically active. It has higher blood flow and is more responsive to hormonal shifts. When your body senses an energy shortfall, visceral fat is often mobilized readily. That is the opportunity. A moderate deficit of roughly 300 to 500 calories per day is often enough to initiate measurable visceral fat loss without triggering severe metabolic adaptation. Here is your practical translation. First, prioritize protein. Protein increases satiety and preserves muscle mass. Muscle preservation protects lever 4, muscle-driven metabolic demand. Aim for a protein intake that distributes evenly across meals. Second, reduce energy-dense, ultra-processed foods. These are foods engineered to be hyper-palatable and easy to overconsume. They quietly sabotage energy balance. Third, increase high-fiber vegetables and whole foods. Fiber slows digestion, improves fullness, and can modestly blunt insulin spikes, supporting lever 2. Now let us correct another myth. Most people think the scale is the best measure of progress. But early visceral fat reduction may not show dramatic scale changes, especially if you are exercising and preserving muscle. A common pattern I see is this: waist circumference drops, fasting glucose improves, triglycerides improve, but total body weight barely changes. That is progress. If you rely only on the scale, you may quit just as visceral fat is shrinking. Here is your second self-check moment. Track waist circumference weekly under the same conditions. If it trends downward over 4 to 8 weeks, even slowly, you are likely reducing visceral fat. One more critical point. There is a ceiling to calorie restriction. Beyond a certain threshold, further restriction does not proportionally accelerate visceral fat loss and increases the risk of muscle loss. Losing muscle undermines lever 4 and makes long-term maintenance harder. If energy balance is too aggressive, it pushes toward muscle loss, hormonal disruption, and eventual rebound weight gain. Recap. A steady, moderate calorie deficit targets visceral fat effectively without sabotaging metabolism. But energy balance alone is not the fastest path. The next lever accelerates the process in a powerful way. Lever 2. Insulin. Signaling and why it matters more than you think. If energy balance is the foundation, insulin signaling is the accelerator. Insulin is not the enemy. It is essential for life. It helps move glucose from your bloodstream into cells for energy. The problem is chronic elevation. When insulin remains elevated for long periods, your body receives a consistent store energy signal, and visceral fat is especially sensitive to that environment. Most people think sugar alone is the issue. But the real driver is repeated spikes combined with reduced insulin sensitivity. Insulin resistance means your cells respond less effectively to insulin. To compensate, the pancreas releases more. Over time, baseline insulin levels rise. That hormonal climate favors abdominal fat storage. Now here is the critical insight. Improving insulin sensitivity often reduces visceral fat even before dramatic weight loss occurs. How do we pull this lever? First, reduce refined carbohydrates that cause rapid blood sugar spikes. White bread, sugary beverages, and ultra-processed snacks create quick surges in glucose. Those surges demand insulin. Second, increase dietary fiber. Soluble fiber slows glucose absorption and reduces post-meal spikes. Foods like legumes, oats, and many vegetables support smoother insulin curves. Third, space your meals intentionally. Constant grazing keeps insulin elevated throughout the day. Allowing periods between meals gives insulin levels time to fall. This is not about extreme fasting. It is about avoiding perpetual stimulation. Fourth, improve sleep. Short sleep duration and poor sleep quality impair insulin sensitivity. Even a few nights of inadequate sleep can measurably worsen glucose control. If insulin resistance persists, it pushes toward prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and further visceral fat expansion. Now let me resolve an earlier open loop. We discussed how visceral fat drains directly to the liver. When insulin resistance develops, the liver increases glucose production even when it should not. That worsens fasting glucose and drives further insulin release. This is how the cycle tightens. A practical self-check. If your fasting glucose is creeping upward year over year, or if your triglycerides are rising, insulin signaling may be compromised. Another myth correction. Most people think cutting all carbohydrates is necessary to reduce visceral fat, but quality and quantity matter more than absolute elimination. Whole food carbohydrates in controlled portions behave very differently than refined sugars. The goal is metabolic flexibility, not fear. Recap. Improving insulin sensitivity lowers the hormonal pressure that drives visceral fat storage. We have addressed energy balance and insulin signaling. Now we turn to a quieter but equally important driver that most people overlook: